in the stone in the Stonewall National Monument, right next to the Stonewall Inn, which is still an open, active bar in Greenwich Village. And just in the last week or two, we've also seen Philadelphia being forced to take down information around history of slavery. So we're in this moment of deep repression over Black histories, queer histories, much less the combination of, right? And so it's so important to highlight them, for our students, both for students who, personally identify with Black history and queer history to learn about their own lineages and ancestors. And as I will also just, argue more generally, Black history and queer history are American history, right? They're part of the American story, and it's important to center the most marginalized people in society. So these are histories that everybody should really know. So thank you again for being on the front lines of bringing these histories into your own classrooms. And I'm excited to hear about, how people do that in the Q&A if we get some more time to talk then. All right. Okay, so I'm sure folks here are coming from different places, and I'm sure some of the information I share might be already well known to folks. But I don't really want to make any assumptions about the audience here. So just a little bit around a term that I'll be using a lot, right? This concept of not only queer identity but also using queer as a verb. So in my own research, even though we generally think of queer as being a kind of a term that was reclaimed in the 1990s, I've actually found historical primary sources of queer men and women identifying themselves as queer, going back as far as the 1930s, even though it didn't become too common a kind of self-identity until the mid 20th century, which George Chauncey talks about a lot in his wonderful book Gay New York, which I also definitely recommend to folks. But amidst the kind of anger and militancy of the AIDS crisis, we have groups like Queer Nation who are forming in response not only to kind of lack of attention to the growing AIDS crisis by the government, but also to rising rates of queer violence in the streets. So we have this kind of anti-assimilationist impulse that becomes associated with the term queer in the early 1990s, right? Kind of before it becomes this just kind of umbrella term as it's used today. It's kind of specifically seen as a more loaded political term, right? Queer folks in the early 90s might not have been the people who were, fighting for same-sex marriage, getting queer people into the military. They were actually trying to push back against these kind of normative narratives. But today I find that young people, don't necessarily differentiate as much in that kind of way, right? With queer being meaning more anti-assimilationist, but it does tend to be more associated with non-heteronormativity and non-gender normativity specifically. So just kind of a larger kind of umbrella term that's often used. And of course, when we're talking about the queer past, historians often try to be as accurate as possible around the terminology being used, which is why my book is titled The Famous Lady Lovers, because both lady lovers as well as women lovers were often terms that both Black and white queer women used for themselves in the 1920s and 30s. So I do try to use kind of more contemporary terms, sorry, the more historical terms when possible there. So yeah, happy to talk more about anything related to terminology at the end, since I probably won't go too much into it in my talk itself now. All right. So before we get to the Great Migration, which is so central to the creation of the Harlem Renaissance, just wanted to give a little bit of feedback, background on the origins of the blues, and there will be some really great resources on my final slide. There's one on the University of Mississippi has a really great list of different sources about the queer blues specifically, and there's a really wonderful music website made by this man named J.D. Doyle, which has an amazing, overwhelming amount of primary sources and information about the queer blues specifically. But before we get to the queer blues, right, just talking about the origins of the blues, this is music arising out of the Delta South at the turn of the century. So usually around 1900 to 1903 is the era in which we see kind of the emergence of the genre of the blues, not really associated with any one particular person. And it's very much music that is based on the working class African American Southern experience, often associated specifically with songs about freedom post-slavery, right, post-emancipation, often coming out of folks who are working in the fields. And of course, this will soon, by the 1920s, become a industrialized northern urban commercial product. The popularity of the blues in the South will lead many white men in the record industry in the North to kind of send folks down to the South to try to discover blues singers. So women like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey were actually performing the blues for decades before they were quote unquote discovered by the northern white-run music industry. So there's a lot of different tensions around race, class, and gender when it comes, of course, to the blues and its dissemination. And then I think another important point here is just that in many ways, early blues and early country music were quite similar. They were both, kind of talking about working class rural experiences in very matter-of-fact ways. So it's not that surprising that there's a lot of early blues songs that just talk about, sexuality or queerness in a very kind of matter-of-fact way. It was just a part of life, unlike kind of early pop songs, which tended to focus more on romance and kind of romanticization, looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. The blues didn't shy away from talking about, the challenges of life in the Jim Crow South, which is really what it was about. And then we'll also see a lot of songs as the Great Migration begins that are about Southern migrants who've moved to the North, missing life in the South and kind of feeling nostalgic for the South, despite Jim Crow racism and violence, because many folks were coming to the North and very disappointed that they were still encountering racism and segregation in the North, even if it wasn't kind of to the letter of the law as it was in the South. In the North, it was often just kind of practiced more um, as a kind of an everyday practice, even if it wasn't on the books in the way it was in Southern states. All right, so. Of course, then the Great Migration is very, very essential here to the kind of movement of Southern African Americans to the North, leading to the creation of neighborhoods such as Harlem, which will become known as the Black Mecca of the US by 1920. So from 1910 to 1920 alone, we have over 1 million Southern African Americans moving both to northern and western cities. And now most folks consider this to be the early Great Migration. Historians and scholars like Isabel Wilkerson basically argue the Great Migration is going on for much of the 20th century, really even into the 60s and 70s in different waves. But this first early wave is going to lead to the creation of many new Black districts in northern cities and will really just change the demographics of the US and urban places in the US, most generally speaking. And so, of course, going along with this, we can say that the Great Migration plays a very important role in creating queer northern communities specifically. So it's very kind of central in the creation of all the sites that we'll look at soon, from clubs where people like Gladys Bentley performed to rent parties where folks like Mabel Hampton met her partner of many years in different spaces within Prohibition. And that's another issue we'll get to as well, both Prohibition, the Great Migration, and then just kind of changing ideas of gender and sexuality in the 20s are three of the main kind of historical events leading to this moment of kind of opportunity and possibility for Black queer subcultures to emerge in the 1920s and 30s. All right. And so, yeah, I do have some resources I will share. So there's a lot of links in here. I think maybe I won't share this one, but this link takes you to a trailer on a new PBS documentary on the Great Migration that I believe just came out in the last year or two, narrated by Henry Louis Gates Jr. So, yeah, there's many wonderful resources to share with y'all, both in the slides, and there's also some in the notes, which you can't see right now. And then in the final slide, there's a bunch more resources. So, as I like to say, sharing links is my love language. So this is just filled with many, many links for y'all. All right, so this is actually a historical newspaper from 1920. It doesn't look so great. This is actually, I believe, probably a picture I took of microfilm in the archives during my dissertation research in Chicago. And this short story here actually tells, sorry, I'm just trying to get this move here. The story that opens my book. So there's this short newspaper article I found. This is from a Black newspaper in Chicago called the Chicago Whip, and the headline is, "Have we a new sex problem here?" And this short article details, quote, "one of the most peculiar divorce cases to yet be heard in Chicago, when it was discovered that a man wanted to get divorced from his wife because she had left him to run away with another woman." So Sherman Robinson and Ida Mae Robinson were married in Illinois in 1910. They lived together until 1916 when she, quote, left him without any cause with a girl she had formerly known in Paducah, Kentucky. And the two women had requested a room and they were living together. So this is the type of very short historical primary source that I kind of read against the grain to create my narrative, right? Something I won't get into too much here is the this kind of the methodological difficulties of doing these types of histories, right? To want to center subjects as marginal in our society as Black queer women, often working class women in the 1920s and 30s. It's challenging to find sources that are actually about their own experiences, told in their own words. So it's much more common to kind of use these quote unquote outsider sources, right? Newspaper articles, often use a lot of Vice reports from different kind of organizations to try to kind of get at these women's lives. So this is the type of source I use. Of course, I don't have any, I did some real digging here, but I didn't find anything else specifically about Ida Mae Robinson or any of her own words, right? So we're just doing kind of a lot of speculation with this type of story here. But I kind of argue that it's a good example of the ways that the Great Migration for some folks, of course, men and women, but for my focus, women specifically are coming to the North from the South, not only to escape Jim Crow racism and violence and to find more opportunities, economically in the North, but also perhaps for the possibility of getting away from, family and nosy neighbors and being able to kind of explore the anonymity of city life, which allows people by this time to experiment with same-sex behaviors and relationships as well, right? So I'm kind of using this source to talk about how the Great Migration was also about creating new opportunities for Black queer women, specifically in cities like New York and Chicago, where they were maybe able to take part in relationships that they didn't feel they were safely able to do so in their small towns, or maybe they didn't even really, realize the possibilities for queer life until they got to New York and Chicago and began to meet other women who are taking part in such a life, which many more women were doing than ever before, especially during Prohibition, which opened up a lot of new spaces for folks. All right, so just one example of how we can kind of queer this narrative of the Great Migration. And there's many, many more examples in my book as well. All right, so some other context going on in this era. So, of course, the 1920s becomes, associated with this Cole Porter song, Anything Goes, right? That's kind of getting at the ways that, ideas from kind of values and morals to ideas around sexuality and gender are beginning to shift in this time here. This kind of is an era that we associate with the post-World War I era. And then, of course, we have the stock market crash of 1929. Prohibition, of course, is a central kind of factor here, as I mentioned. So with alcohol becoming illegal to purchase from 1919 to 1933, all these legal illicit speakeasy spaces opened up, and there was hundreds and hundreds of them in New York City. Probably in Manhattan alone at this time. So these were often, basement spaces or other spaces that were kind of turned into kind of illegal bars. Oftentimes you had to know a password to be able to get in. And basically, the 19th Amendment was the first amendment to actually curb Americans' rights, right? To take a right away from them, the very American right to, enjoy a cold one. So many Americans, of course, bonded together over their hatred of prohibition. And also in these, speakeasies and other illicit spaces that were often also many private parties, such as rent parties or buffet flats that were often run by entrepreneurial Black women. These were spaces where people said, well, actually, I enjoyed breaking this one law, right? Trying some bootleg alcohol, even though you're not supposed to have it. So, what else you got, right? These became spaces where people were experimenting with same-sex and interracial flirtations, dancing. There was often sex work and gambling going on as well. So, I will. I think I mentioned in one of my slides in the notes that I myself don't have experience teaching K through 12. So, of course, I fully understand that not every subject I'm going to talk about here is going to be appropriate for all levels. So, of course, I will leave folks to their own ideas of what is appropriate. So I'm trying to, of course, keep that in mind here as well. Um, Yes, so of course, also in the 1920s, it's kind of the first time where it becomes acceptable for heterosexual women to gather in spaces where alcohol is served with men. In the past, they'd always been associated with sex work to do so. So we're kind of seeing more freedoms really for all women around sexuality in the 1920s, right? Not only for queer women. And of course, this is also, of course, on the tails of again, not all women, but some women getting the right to vote in 1920. Of course, being down here in the South, I'm always reminding folks that, in the 20s through 1965, Black women in the South did not have that right to vote. So, of course, this is something that is not available to all women until post 1965 and the Voting Rights Act here. All right, so again, the kind of the new permissibility of the Jazz Age and Prohibition are giving people more reasons to kind of break conventions. So that's kind of the larger takeaway point here for my larger context. And then a little bit more on changing ideas of gender and sexuality in the 1920s. Um, just a couple different images here. So again, this is a time when we have more women than ever coming into the public sphere, right? More women are now taking up jobs that have been in the past associated with men. So there's a lot of different kind of, issues around gender blurring here, right? Some of them might be issues we associate with, actual queerness or gender transgression, and some are just these like social changes, right, around women coming more into the public sphere, the world of work, the world of, politics and ideas. And these had always, of course, been spheres associated with men in the past. So we have this song here from 1926 that I love to share with my students, and I think this will be probably I'll share a little clip of this here. So this is from YouTube. So it's called "Masculine Women, Feminine Men," and it really, of course, again gets at this kind of conundrum over changing ideals in the 1920s from women now having, shorter hair to men, especially, men in early silent films wearing makeup, for example. So a lot of ruminations over how, gender norms are changing. What does that mean for society? So I'll just play a little bit of this song, even though it's not a blues song. Him and I going mad today. Hey, hey, fellas are just as bad. I'll say, go anywhere, just stand and stare. You'll say they're bucks when you look at the clothes they wear. Masculine women, feminine men. Which is a rooster, which is a hen? It's hard to tell them apart today. And say, sister is busy learning to shave. Brother just loves his permanent ways. It's hard to tell them apart today. Hey, hey, girls were girls and boys were boys when I was the top. Now we don't know who is who or even what's slippers and trousers, baggy and wide. Nobody knows who's walking inside. Those masculine women and feminine men. Come, look, listen, and you'll agree. All right. So it gives you a sample of this song, which is a great song again to play to kind of introduce folks to the discourse on changing ideas of gender and sexuality in the 1920s. And it's also a good moment to kind of think about how, we're not, of course, we're in a very obvious current moment that constantly reminds us we're not just on this, upward path towards progress, right? We take kind of one step forward, two steps back. But many historians talk about how in the 1920s and 30s, we're seeing, more queer visibility. And then after World War II, right, we go into this much more repressive era with, the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare, right? So we're seeing in some ways almost kind of more queer visibility in the 20s and 30s than we'll actually see in some other coming decades. All right, so then this brings us to the Harlem Renaissance. We have this great quote again from Henry Louis Gates, where he reflected that the Harlem Renaissance was surely as gay as it was Black, not that it was exclusively either of these things. So, of course, we think of this as a literary and cultural flowering centering in New York City's Harlem, lasting between the 1920s through the 1930s. And of course, we often talk about how even though, Harlem is in the title in some ways here, Harlem is also a state of mind. Or you can also use, the term the New Negro Renaissance to kind of also talk about art and culture in Chicago or in other cities, right? While this is kind of centered in Harlem, it's not only happening in Harlem. So we have many queer folks who were involved, from someone like Alain Locke, who was a Howard University professor who published the anthology, The New Negro, to blues singers such as Bessie Smith and Alberta Hunter, to County Cullen, Claude McKay, many other writers, Langston Hughes. So the list just goes on and on. Dorothy West would be somebody else. So many, many folks involved were, known or rumored to have taken part in queer relationships. And of course, this is an era in which basically I'd say being queer at this time was really often just an open secret, right? It was something that people often knew about, but it wasn't something people necessarily talked about. This idea of coming out of the closet is a really more kind of a post-Stonewall term specifically. And actually, we'll talk a little bit later about some of the drag balls that emerge in New York in the 1920s and 30s. And they use the term coming out differently. For them, coming out was about coming out like into queer society, kind of like coming out as a debutante, coming into society, but into a queer society. Whereas the kind of post-Stonewall idea of coming out of the closet was more about kind of like coming out to your straight family and coworkers and neighbors, right? So I kind of like the earlier version where coming out was more about, coming out to the queer world, even if, of course, the reason for that difference was because it wasn't as, safe and welcoming to do that into the straight world. So many of the folks involved in the Harlem Renaissance who were queer tended to, conceal their sexuality and their gender identities. And I'll mention it in other times, but if folks in the New York City area haven't been, you have until March 8th to check out the fabulous exhibit at the New York Historical, The Gay Harlem Renaissance, which is, as far as I know, one of the first major museum exhibits on the queer Harlem Renaissance. And I was incredibly honored to get to be on the scholarly advisory committee for that, and I got to attend the fabulous opening party for it. And I will have a couple other short video clips from the exhibit to share here. So yeah, definitely check that out if you are in the area and you have time before March 8th. Highly recommended. Also, obviously, I'm biased about that one there. All right, so here I have a short video. Maybe I'll play a couple minutes of this one. This is about a 5-minute video from Time on the Gay Harlem Renaissance, which would be a great resource to share with students.
Some of the ways that we understand American gay history is through the Stonewall uprising as a before and after, right? But I think before Stonewall, there was this incredible moment of gay liberation, queer liberation, Black liberation in the 20s in Harlem.
Most people remember learning about the Harlem Renaissance in school. Langston Hughes, blues, jazz, an explosion of artistic talent. But what we don't learn about is that Harlem was also a thriving gay community.
So the way that Harlem became a haven for LGBT life is the way that it became a haven for Black people from all over the world, really. It became this crossroads, right? And the big part of this is the Great Migration, which obviously meant that a lot of Black people came north, especially to cities that are now considered Black cities like Chicago and Harlem in New York City. Was known at the time as the Black Mecca, right? And so it was in some ways the largest Black city in the world. And it did, of course, include a lot of energy and excitement, cabaret, blues, jazz. So it really was in some ways a crossroads of all of these different artistic and musical and cultural energies. A lot of white patrons would go to Harlem, to quote unquote slum, because the mores were much more relaxed. And especially during the Prohibition era, a lot of these were in some ways, speakeasies.
Vices flourished in Harlem because African Americans did not have the political power to be able to demand that government keep these things out of their neighborhood. And the corruption of the police and of judges, all of that enabled gay activity as well as all kinds of other activity to thrive in Harlem.
A lot of the reasons that a lot of Black folks
Stop that there. So yeah, so another great little video resource to kind of set the context here for students. All right, so then as I mentioned, another feature of the Harlem Renaissance was these fabulous drag balls, which started in places like the Hamilton Lodge in Harlem. And these were incredibly popular with both white and Black, queer and straight people at this time. As you can see, this one here is a headline for a ball that drew over 7,000 people. Sadly, we have very few kind of photographs to document these experiences here. But on the right, you can see an image of some of the fabulous outfits that the drag queens wore. And actually, the costume in the middle was recreated for the Gay Harlem Renaissance exhibit at the New York Historical. So you can go see like this fabulous recreation of one of these ensembles, and these were written about very detailed in the Black press. It's really fascinating to look back on them. It was almost as if we might imagine that Black cisgender women were kind of getting their ideas for fashion from the latest outfits worn by drag queens in these early balls. So that's definitely an exciting kind of detail of this world here. And while they tended to feature folks who were known at the time as female impersonators or drag queens, we're also seeing some male impersonators or drag kings as well. And I'll talk momentarily about Gladys Bentley, who was probably the most well-known of the drag kings of this time period. It's very, very popular amongst all different audiences. And again, as that last video clip mentioned, we have this notion of slumming, this idea of white people coming kind of from downtown or from the suburbs to go to Harlem for the night, right? To kind of have this, exotic, wild, outrageous experience, then go home and tell your friends about it. So it's kind of going along with this notion that was popular in the 20s, this idea of primitivism, this concept that kind of suggested that Black people were, closer kind of to nature. So this is this moment in which their art is becoming more popular than ever with white audiences, but in a very, objectifying, patronizing lens, right? So of course there's, plenty of tensions going on in this moment. And then there's also a lot of white philanthropists, most famously Carl Van Vechten, who are supporting financially many of the Black artists during the Harlem Renaissance as well. All right, so then of course this brings us to the women who are at the heart of my book, the queer blues women of the time period. On the left in this image, we have Gladys Bentley. And then kind of going clockwise, we have Alberta Hunter, Ethel Waters, and Gertrude Ma Rainey on the bottom, all women who are known to have had or rumored to have had relationships with women, really often during the height of their fame in the 1920s and 30s. So very few of these women specifically self-identified as lesbian or bisexual. But although we do have a great quote in one of Donald Bogle's books about Ethel Waters, where she told a friend once, I'm a lesbian and the best to ever have done it. So we have do have that on record here. But again, this is a time period when being queer was often just an open secret. Some women sung about queerness, queer subjects. Some of them tried to kind of distance themselves from them, even though everybody knew that they had relationships with other women. Ethel Waters was also for a while in a relationship with a dancer named Ethel Williams. They were known as the two Ethels, and they were often seen having lovers' quarrels on the streets in Harlem. And they sometimes even did performances where they referred to each other as partner to kind of play with their audiences. And of course, these are also women who are often performing for mixed audiences, right? So there'll be some people there who are aware that they're queer, have heard rumors, other people who have no idea. So kind of performing for straight and queer audiences. So their songs were often filled with kind of sexual double entendres. And so the people who got it, might know what's going on. And for other people, it might little go over their heads a little bit there. And then again, all of the kind of more smaller spaces that are opening up in the Prohibition era, such as speakeasies, kind of more divey types of bars, private parties, are spaces in which women are going to feel kind of more comfortable both taking part in same-sex behaviors, maybe some flirty dancing, or performing queer songs, kind of for more smaller audiences. All right, and here this link goes to the trailer for a short documentary on these women. We're gonna have time to watch a little bit of this one. Yeah, so this is the documentary. And another link has the Bessie Smith link has a link to the full documentary, so you don't have to pay to watch it. It's called Tain't Nobody's Business: Queer Blues Divas of the 1920s. And this is the trailer.
They were the first popularizers of the blues form. They were bringing the gospel of blues to every city and town. And let's say that that gospel was essentially be free to do what the hell you want to do.
Last night with a crowd of my friends, they must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men. Do I wear a collar and a tie? Make the wind blow all the while. They say
Black divas were expected to deviate from feminine ideals held up by the rest of society, and deviate they did.
It seemed that Ma had found herself in an embarrassing tangle with the Chicago police. She and a group of young ladies had been drinking. The law arrived just as the impromptu party got intimate.
She was a great role model, an example of the kind of woman that I thought I might want to be able to speak my truths and live my life on my own terms.
Ethel Waters was called a bulldog, a terrible name.
Alberta Hunter was a lesbian, and she did hide it. Of course, she couldn't hide it from the people she worked with, but she did hide it.
All right. I will stop there, but that is another amazing resource. And I mean, there's so many ways that these women are exceptional. I mean, there really was no like comparative white cohort to them. I mean, we might think of somebody like Mae West, for example. She'd probably be a good exception. But in terms of them, often being working class women singing unashamedly about their sexual desires. Many of them were larger women, unashamedly singing about, being beautiful and what they wanted in the world. There were songs that were often sung specifically kind of to a female audience and giving them advice about relationships and other issues. And these are also women who were, grew up in poverty in the Jim Crow South and became some of the first Black celebrities in the early 20th century. And of course, that brought a lot of tensions about as well. There's this, about a story about Ma Rainey that's actually illustrated, I think, in the Netflix film based on the play about her, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, talks about the tensions of her, going to Chicago to record some songs, showing up in like a limousine and all this splendor and still having to kind of, walk through the back door for help, right? Like kind of the segregated space into the home. So being kind of part of the mainstream entertainment industry and yet still being treated as lesser than in the Jim Crow era. So there's just, plenty of tensions we can get at with them. Also, when I teach the 20s, about the 1920s in my modern US survey classes, we just talk about kind of the tensions of the era, right? The 20s politically were rather conservative, and yet we're seeing, shifting ideas around gender and sexuality. We're seeing blues women become incredibly successful, but it's still an incredibly racist era as well. And some of the ads created to sell their records by white companies feature kind of minstrel images of Black women, right? Racist kind of stereotypes of them. So it's another good example of kind of the tensions of the era. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, with the popularity of slumming, that kind of gets at these tensions too. There's more interest than ever in Black culture, but that doesn't mean Black people are being treated equally, right? They're kind of being treated as a spectacle. Okay, I'm doing on time. Pretty good here. All right, and so then this is the Ma Rainey song that you actually just saw a clip of a woman performing in that last video. So this is probably her queerest song, Prove It On Me Blues. This came out in 1928. And so it was in 1926 that there was a rumor, which was just kind of also narrated in the last video. There was a rumor that after one of her performances, Ma Rainey and all of her chorus girls were having a party that was rather insinuated to almost kind of be turning into an orgy. It was said that some women were, taking their clothes off and getting more comfortable, but they'd been so loud that somebody called the police, and the police showed up, and Ma Rainey actually allegedly fell down the stairs into the arms of a policeman, and Bessie Smith supposedly had to bail her out of jail the next day. And I actually, as a naive grad student, I went to Chicago trying to find like evidence of this ever happening, and of course I was not able to find anything of it. But some people say she actually wrote this song to kind of capitalize off of that rumor around the event that had happened earlier here. But this song is more just getting at kind of different ideas around gender here. So I will play it, a little clip of it here while we can read the lyrics along.
Together, why she was out to the the people heard that I took it. I didn't know when she said I want to hold you. She went out last night with a crowd of my friends. Been up there, don't like no man. It's to a wild color. It's a wild color. Yeah,
All right. Okay, so then this is an ad that ran in the Black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, which was from Chicago but read all over the country. And I find this ad to be so fascinating. So it's pretty similar to the types of ads that were created by the race records industry at this time. And race records was kind of the segregated term for, the sector of the record industry that sold records by and for African Americans. It later became known as rhythm and blues in the 1940s and 50s. But in the 20s, it was race records. And so every record, they would put out an ad like this where there's kind of cartoonish figures representing the singer and other people she's interacting with. And they're having they're in some sort of situation that you need to buy the record to kind of find out what's going on. And so here, I think it's fascinating because the song itself doesn't feature a policeman in it, but as you can see here, a policeman is actually put into this image, and I blew up some of the text of it here. So here we see Ma Rainey wearing a men's fedora and kind of menswear from the waist up, along with two other women dressed similarly. And since in the 20s, it was still very rare for women to wear pants. So for women to be wearing menswear from the waist up definitely signified lesbianism or, being somewhat mannish at this time. And so the text says, what's all this? Scandal? Maybe so, but you wouldn't have thought it of Ma Rainey. But look at the cop watching her. What does it all mean? Right. So I think it's very interesting that this, song that was about lesbianism, but doesn't feature a policeman, actually has a policeman put in the ad to kind of, suggest that there's something nefarious going on here, right? Usually an image of several women on a street corner at night would often signify, sex work, prostitution, but here it's kind of like the specter of lesbianism. So I think this ad is very fascinating. And again, we don't have too many of these types of, advertisements that, hint at anything related to queer Black culture at this time. So this ad is one of the first we can see. And so I argue that this song and this record are kind of some of the first objects we might say are part of Black queer popular culture specifically. All right, so then of course I also have to talk a little bit about Bessie Smith, another very important singer here. So there's a lot of scholarship by kind of older blues men who thought that Bessie Smith was basically kind of Ma Rainey's younger protege, insinuating that they had some sort of romantic or sexual relationship. But that was something the two women would just like get together and laugh about, like these long-standing rumors that they had a romantic relationship. It doesn't seem to have been true. But they both were incredibly popular. Bessie Smith was known as the Empress of the Blues. Ma Rainey was known as the Mother of the Blues. She sold millions of records over her career for Columbia Records and had over 7,000 people attend her funeral after her sudden tragic death in a car accident in Mississippi in 1937. She was born in poverty near Chattanooga, started singing on the street as a young child, to support herself. And she definitely had a bit of reputation for enjoying her drink, for getting a little loud sometimes, and her bisexuality was pretty much an open secret. She was married to a man who served as her manager, but she had many relationships, especially with women who were on her shows with her. And yes, kind of seems from today, it seems like the power dynamics were a little bit problematic sometimes, seemed like sometimes she'd kind of, put a force her couple of her chorus girls to kind of like compete against each other for her attention, for example. But so she's someone who sang a few songs that kind of hint at queerness, but nothing too overt, it seems as if, because she actually had relationships with women that we know about. And I should say for Ma Rainey, we don't actually know of any specific woman who she was in a relationship with. Again, in the film Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, there's a woman who's kind of presented as her girlfriend slash kind of a groupie, but we don't actually know of any women she actually had relationships with aside from the rumors. So if that was the case, perhaps it was easier for her to kind of sing and talk about queerness since it wasn't something she was associated with as much in real life, whereas Bessie Smith actually had relationships with women after 1926. We know of several of them. So that might have been one of the reasons she kind of shied away from the topic a little bit more in song. And also as she was kind of upheld more in Harlem than Ma Rainey was. The Ma Rainey song "Prove It on My Blues" that I just stopped playing a clip of. If I kept playing that clip, you'd hear like a jug band playing. So Ma Rainey was very country, whereas Bessie Smith, she was often recording songs with Louis Armstrong, and she kind of became a bit more associated with jazz as well as blues, and not just kind of like the rural South. So that was there's a lot of different kind of musical nuances between these folks that you can get into as well. And I wanted to play a verse from probably her queerest song here, Foolish Man Blues. So this is another, so I mentioned earlier, often the many queer blues songs had kind of double entendres to them. This one uses this other a technique where she kind of refers to there's two things that confuse me, and then she kind of presents them, and it's kind of like, are you really confused by that, or are you just trying to kind of give voice to them? So I think this is kind of one of those songs. I'll just play the first two verses of Foolish Man Blues by Bessie Smith from 1927.
Insurance people, they getting worse every day. Lord, they getting worse every day. Acting like a bunch of women, they just gabbing, gabbing, gabbing away. There's two things got me puzzled. There's two things I can't understand. There's two things got me puzzled. There's two things I can't understand. A managed acting woman and a skipping, twisting woman acting man. Oh,
Right. So, and then another important piece of information here is that actually early in her career, Bessie Smith also did a little bit of male impersonation on stage as well, right? So yeah, so we know of her having relationships with women. She performed in drag at times, and yet she's singing in this song about how she doesn't understand, a mannish acting woman and a feminine man. So again, she seems to be kind of like calling something out and saying she doesn't understand it actually when she does. So again, this might have been kind of part of her strategy for not presenting as too queer, but to kind of still kind of bring up queer issues in song. There's a lot of kind of layers and complexity going on here, but this is one of her most queer songs. All right. So I also wanted to share this amazing image, and yeah, you can really zoom in and see so many exciting details here. There's only a few illustrations in my book, and this is one of them. And they also did a really amazing, huge blow up of this. That's kind of an interactive part of the exhibit at the Gay Harlem Renaissance exhibit at the New York Historical. So another reason to go check that out. So this is a 1930s nightclub map of Harlem, which seems to be kind of primarily again made for white slummers to kind of figure out where they're supposed to go here. There's all these different clubs. There's different. It even shows you, where you can purchase some marijuana cigarettes on the street. I'm sorry, you can tell I'm not used to doing this for K through 12. Apologies here. Take from this what you can. But for our attention, specifically here, we have Gladys's Clam House. So Gladys Bentley, that well-known, infamous male impersonator of the era, became so successful by the early to mid 1930s that she even had a club named after her. So it says here, Gladys Bentley wears a tuxedo and high hat and tickles the ivories. So there's different kind of queer signifiers going on throughout this map of different Black theaters and speakeasies and restaurants and other spots in Harlem. So this is a really great kind of visual source you can share with students here. And then a little bit more on Gladys Bentley, who's definitely one of my favorite figures from this period. And yeah, huge image of her kind of greets you when you would go to the Gay Harlem Renaissance exhibit. So she's one of the most visible and infamous lesbian performers of the late 20s to the 1940s. And again, she's one of these women who, using the term out of the closet for her, even though it's a post-Stonewall term, it would be appropriate really for her more so than any of the other blues women. She never tried to hide her sexuality. She preferred to wear men's clothes on the street as well as on stage. And again, that was very scandalous to do. It wasn't until World War II, when all the women went into the war industry, that it became more commonplace for women to wear pants on the street. So before then, it was often seen as something quite shocking. And so she was an amazing piano player. There's a video clip here we do have one amazing short video piece of her. She actually performs later in life in the early 50s on a Groucho Marx talk show, and she's playing piano there. So you can actually see her amazing piano skills. She became well known for kind of often taking popular songs and rewriting the lyrics to make them a little scandalous. She also flirted with all of the women in her audience. And it's fascinating because there keeps being more and more work done on this, but we still don't know who it was. She allegedly married a woman in Atlantic City. Of course, it wasn't, a legal binding marriage, but I actually came across many examples of Black queer women having marriage type relationships. And events and traditions in the 1920s and 30s, knowing, of course, that they weren't legally binding. But yeah, we don't know who it was, but allegedly a white woman who was also a performer who was presumably femme presenting was her partner, and they actually had a marriage ceremony in Atlantic City. So she was not one to shy away from her queerness, and she, of course, became incredibly well known for this. She also was someone who, became associated the most with this kind of concept of slumming, of white people going to Harlem to kind of, take in these outrageous performances, to see a large masculine Black queer woman playing, these dirty songs on the piano was very shocking to some. And so of course this made, many more quote unquote respectable folks, religious leaders and other people in Harlem didn't, were not fans of someone like Gladys Bentley. They did not appreciate that she was becoming a representative of Harlem to, white audiences who were coming to see her. So again, kind of getting at these larger tensions that are emerging here. But yeah, there's a short documentary about her that you can watch here, and she's definitely a key kind of figure to highlight here when it comes to queer visibility at this time. Also, yeah, so for male impersonators, they kind of came in and out of fashion in the late 19th century. They were pretty popular before female masculinity became associated with like lesbianism specifically, and they will kind of emerge again in the 40s and 50s and 60s. But really, for her period, she's really one of the most famous male impersonators. There's not too many. Again, there's not really a parallel of white performers doing something really that similar to her in this time period. So she's very very exceptional for her for her queerness and for her outrageousness in this time. And also, yeah, definitely check out the video clip because she's an incredible piano player as well. All right, I'm starting to wind things up here. Just want to share one other little story and source with you here. So again, one of the other few images in my book here. So this is a card for a private party thrown during the early Depression in 1932 here. And these types of invitations to house parties were often, given from individual to individual. Sometimes they were kind of put in the grate of a window of a building as people passed by. And so, of course, for many African Americans in Harlem, life was challenging both before, during, and after the Great Depression. But since it became even, more challenging for many to pay their rent during the Great Depression, it became common for folks to have rent parties, which I really now see as a form of mutual aid. It's everybody kind of pooling in to help somebody pay their rent, and then you get to attend a fabulous party where there's often food and drinks and live entertainment and maybe some other types of festivities going on as well here. These parties were, as quote here, recommended as the place for newly arrived single gals to get acquainted with others. And I love this story specifically because we often think of gay men kind of taking part in this more public street culture. Again, George Chauncey talks a lot about how in the 20s and 30s, men often met in parks and on the street and in other places. But we don't tend to associate queer women with just, meeting in public or on the street, for example. But in this instance, one day in 1932, queer Harlemite Mabel Hampton met a woman named Lillian Foster while she was waiting for the bus, and she gave her a card for this rent party that she was throwing. And she ended up going to that party, and that was a good thing because, oh, well, let me just go forward and then I'll go back. So here's two images of Mabel Hampton and Lillian Foster. So they met at this party and then they lived together for, I think, around 40 years. They were a couple for over 40 years in Harlem, and Mabel Hampton, actually, it's kind of a complex story. She actually was, I believe, a maid for or a nurse for Joan Nestle's mother, and Joan Nestle, who started the Lesbian History Archives. So Mabel, and then she discovered that Mabel Hampton was a queer woman who'd been very active in, queer Harlem circles in the 20s and 30s and was a performer as well. So she's done all these amazing oral histories that have been digitized and are also available on tape that you could access through the Lesbian History Archives. And so it's a very rare window into the actual first person experience of a Black queer working class woman who was, active in queer Harlem life in the 20s and 30s. So yes, you can learn more about her life through the Lesbian History Archives. And then I just want to share one more little source here. So this is this amazing painting by Mabel Dwight, Harlem Rent Party. And just to give you a little bit more flavor of the rent party, I have one of the short stories that have been created for social media for the Gay Harlem Renaissance exhibit about the rent party.
Due and payday can't come fast enough? Throw a party, of course. Because of residential segregation starting in the 1910s and 20s, landlords could charge exorbitantly high rents in Harlem. Low wages made it even harder for households to pay. Rent parties offered a creative solution. For a few cents at the door, guests got music, dancing, and food. And with enough partygoers, hosts got enough to pay the landlord. Some LGBTQ plus Harlemites were drawn to rent parties with an exclusively gay guest list. But most openly danced and flirted with people of the same sex while socializing with their straight neighbors. This was a powerful sign of acceptance among Harlem's working class residents. To promote these parties, Harlemites printed and handed out cards, often featuring clever rhymes and fun little details. The cards on view in our new exhibition were all collected by the poet Langston Hughes, except for one special card. After dancer Mabel Hampton struck up a conversation with Lillian Foster at a bus stop, Foster handed her this rent party invitation. The two went on to become romantic partners for more than 4 decades, living together in the Bronx. Hampton kept this card for the rest of her life. Learn more when you visit the Gay Harlem Renaissance, on view now at the New York Store.
All right. Okay, I think I went way over my time after saying that I would not do that. So, takeaways. Queer African Americans have been important makers and shapers of American culture for over a decade now, right? I love this about studying the 1920s, still exactly a century away, right? So 1926 to 2026, we now have a century of known history about this important subculture here. As I've mentioned, the Great Migration plays a very important role in even initially creating queer Northern communities and Black queer subcultures and networks in the 20s and 30s. And some of the earliest representations of queer popular culture and music were created by Black artists. So, of course, queer history and Black history are American history. And then my last slide has a bunch of other resources to share with y'all. So I will stop now. So hopefully we have a little time left for Q&A. And thank y'all so much for staying with me through my long talk.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Cookie. And as Cookie made clear, we'll have copies of her slides available to share with you so you can directly access her links and more. Stacy, do you want to say anything else about resources?
Sure. I'm going to pop into the chat for you a Google Drive folder. I don't want to take up too much of your time because you can all look through it on your own as your time allows, but it has some primary sources, some secondary sources. Professor Woolner's slides are in there with all of the resources embedded in those slides, all of those links, which I fully agree. Giving people links is my love language too. That and spreadsheets. So I really like that. Like struck me. Um, so there's lots of things for you to parse through. Lots of things that are like classroom ready for K-12 students. Um, and if you have any questions about anything that's in there, or if you have trouble accessing anything in the drive, you all have my email address from the calendar invite tonight, so you can just shoot me an email and I will help you out with that.
So we have some time left. If people have questions, comments, things they want to have a chance to talk about with Cookie or with the other great minds in the group. You can either put questions and comments in the chat or just unmute yourself and jump in. So there's a question in the chat. I can read it to you, Cookie, and then Samuel, you can unmute yourself and maybe take two questions at once, Cookie, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the question in the chat is asking about the role of religion for people coming from the South and then encountering this Black queer culture.
Yes. Well, yeah. So the first thing I think of doesn't actually have to do with folks from the South, but yeah, in the 1920s in Harlem, we do get one of the very first sermons that kind of talks about queerness negatively, which is another kind of way that we can learn that it's kind of becoming more visible at this time, right? That it's beginning to be something that people are kind of talking about, how it's like a problem that there's so many queer women in the church and they're seen as, these stereotypes go back so far, like already in the 20s, they're talking about how, older women are trying to seduce younger women. So there are a few kind of, yeah, in the North, religious authorities who are beginning to, speak about queerness in negative ways in the Black church. But yeah, to be honest, religion isn't kind of one of my main focuses. So I'm not sure I have too much more that I can add to it. But it is a really great question. And yeah, there's a lot of folks now starting to do work on kind of more queer Southern history and kind of bringing that to the fore. Because obviously I am here in the Bible Belt. I'm a bit of an anomaly here. But yeah, no, that is a great question. I'm sorry I can't answer it more fully.
Hi, thank you for speaking once. Really interesting, fascinating work. Um, as a teacher, one of the things that I try to do with my students is give them a broader context, right? So where this history sits in. And I found one of the consistent lines of inquiry my students have revolves around, well, what was the discourse at the time, right? So where does this queerness sit in and the popular sort of understanding, right? We have these culture wars, as it were, today. LGBTQ issues and debate, I feel like, are something you can come across on the news fairly regularly. But what about in the 20s and 30s? Was this a sort of, don't ask, don't tell? It's not really in the public narrative and discourse at all outside of these spaces. Was it actually something that was being discussed more? Um, yeah, just kind of wondering from that broader cultural
Yeah.
perspective.
That'd be great. Yeah. Yeah. As far as women go, which has been my focus, yeah, there's some of the first, like outside of like Black queer culture, just in terms of kind of more mainstream white dominant culture, we're seeing some of the first Broadway plays that talk about lesbianism. So there's one in 1926 called The Captive. And again, yeah, it's kind of about like an older woman trying to seduce a younger woman. We also have the 1928 publication of the British book, The Well of Loneliness, which is really popular in the US. And that's kind of putting forth more of kind of like a first person account of queerness, kind of talking about as if like, like yes, I'm kind of this miserable creature, but it's like how I'm born, and so you can't hold it against me, kind of. So, yeah. So there's beginning to be a little bit of the kind of medical discourse, and of course we have the beginning of like sexology and Freud and stuff like that. So, but yeah, then we also have there's a little bit like the lesbian historian Lillian Faderman talks about how in the 1920s, amongst more elite women, we see the beginning of like bisexuality being kind of trendy, and I see that as kind of going along with the rise of the flapper figure who is really
Mm,
more kind of about associated more with kind of like the male gaze. That's the GAZE, of course. It gets confusing in queer history. So yeah, so we're beginning to see the ideas around, like women kind of being more overtly sexual in film, and then that kind of being associated a little bit with bisexuality. So yeah, like I really see a lot of the same types of discourse, right, around like queer women's sexuality being more for men than for women, of queerness beginning to be like pathologized and talked about as something medical that could possibly be changed or not. And yeah, so it's definitely beginning to kind of come up a little bit. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
thank
Thanks
you.
for coming. Anyone else? I know it's getting late there, so I'm sure folks are probably ready to move on with their evening. Thank you all so much
Um,
for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah, my email's on here too. If anybody gets the book and wants to talk more about it, I'd be happy to. So, thank you so much for your interest, and I hope you find something out of this that you can share with your students.
Thank you so much, Cookie. It was great.
Thank you,
Thank
Cookie.
you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for hosting.
Hi,
Thanks,
James.
everybody. Take care. Be in touch.
Hi, Lisa. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Good to see you all.
Ah.
There.
She was so good.
Yeah. Whoops. Um, yeah, and the book is just, it's such a good read also.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited that we got to do that for people. And we had a good crowd.
Yeah. Like half
Yeah.
the number of people who had registered. It's
Well,
good.
truthfully, I've done so many sessions where we get like a quarter or a third of the people who register.
Mm-hmm.
So I will take half.
And I saw you had emailed Jake, so we'll just wait to see what he says.